Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you for everybody who's here to listen. It's a treat for me to come back to Champaign, where I did spend many, I counted 5 years that I spent here, which may not seem like a lot, but so it's really nice to be back. Okay, so when those of us who were in Italy, in Pavia, met, I was in Pavia and I presented a paper, which was a version of the framework that I have developed to try to understand the process of racialization in pre-colonial West Africa, in the region of the Sahel, along the southern edge of the Sahara Desert. And in that paper, I argued that racialization was quite old in that part of the world, predating extant written sources produced in the region by Muslim scholars, and certainly long predating European colonization. I suggested that Muslim West African scholars had not adopted a Mediterranean-derived theory of racial difference, but that instead we could understand racialization as a process tied to claims to regional Islamic authority and to the importance of racialized slavery in that region. And I mean, I know all this because I went back and looked at what I did. I'm sure nobody remembers, but I presented one example of a text that was meant to illustrate what I was talking about. And this was an 18th century legal opinion from what is today Mauritania, having to do with a bounty hunter who was trying to recover some kidnapped or runaway enslaved people. And as I remember, this example was too complicated and the time wasn't sufficient, and probably it's all just nothing really sank in very well. But as I understood it, this second meeting was, an opportunity to think about the kinds of sources that we might want to use to publish or to push forward a way of thinking about these topics that would be helpful for potential readers and potential audiences. So what I might have been expected to do was to use this gathering to present a fuller version of that text or of others like it drawn from West African jurisprudential literature. And if indeed that is interesting to the people here running this larger project, then I could, of course, still do that. But left to my own devices, I decided instead that the text that I wanted to present here was something different, both in terms of genre and in terms of the historical period in which it was produced. And so I propose to present a historical chronicle written in Timbuktu, probably in the early 1950s, which was clearly intended to support a political project with a very direct racial implication in the context of African decolonization. So that is what I'm going to do here today. This is the name of the text. This is the first page of the manuscript that we have of it. You can see the author here is somebody born in the early 20th century who lived until 1973. And you can see at the bottom that a lightly edited version of the Arabic text was published in Libya in 2010. And this is the manuscript itself is held in the main Malian archive of Arabic manuscript materials, which is here, and here's the actual record of it. So Timbuktu is located here on the map, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Timbuktu because it's such a central piece of the story that Mohammed Mahmoud wants to tell. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my time today to present some of the context for this historical moment in this particular place. Then I'll introduce the intellectual and political career of Muhammad Mahmud Wulda Sheikh, the man who wrote this chronicle. And then I'm going to give a couple of examples from the text of the chronicle, which illustrate how this chronicle can be understood as a racial history of Timbuktu and the Niger Bend region of what is today Mali, where that famous city of Timbuktu is located. I think there are good reasons to include a discussion of this chronicle in the larger project that brings us all together. But it's also true that this is a project that I've been working a lot on lately, so it suits my particular scholarly energy at the moment. And that's also why I've added a co-author to this paper, my colleague Shahid Mathi from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, who's also really the only other person who's worked on this text, I think, at least academically. And so he doesn't know that he's a co-author, but it'll be perhaps a welcome surprise, perhaps a disappointment that his name is being used in this way, but in any event, I've decided to do that. Okay, Timbuktu, famous place. Famous famous for a number of reasons, famous in the European imagination, famous, here it is on the 14th century Catalan Atlas, as a site of gold and commercial relations across the Sahara. Here it is also the site of this king of what we call ancient Mali, holding this golden orb. In the 19th century, Timbuktu was an object of fascination and of European explorers trying to reach there. A number of them lost their lives doing so. Here are the 19th century European explorers who managed to reach this, the first ones who managed to reach the city. And these are just some colorful sketches of Timbuktu in the 19th century as produced by these scholars. This one comes from Heinrich Barth. Timbuktu became an object of colonial competition, and when France was able to conquer the city in 1894, it was accompanied by a kind of, from the point of view of the French, a colossal military defeat. But that defeat only made increased the value, if you like, of those who participated in the ultimate conquest of Timbuktu. And the person who succeeded in establishing French colonial control over Timbuktu eventually became the head of the French army during the First World War. So colonial conquest could have a lot of value symbolically and in terms of one's career. This is a grave of one of the first French people who tried to get to Timbuktu, and his column was massacred by local people, and this is the sort of symbolic overcoming of this, which became quite important. The garrison that was established by the French at Timbuktu was named after this slain French officer. Okay, so here's this region of Africa that came to be controlled by France, in purple here, just giving us a larger sense of what we're talking about. And here's just a couple of pictures of Timbuktu taken from an airplane about 20 years ago. The main congregational mosque, the Djingaribert on the one side, and the main mosque known for the neighborhood of Senkore, a region of the city which is especially associated with people from the north, people from North Africa, people from Ghadames, people from Arawan, where the author of this chronicle comes from. And here's a slightly closer picture of this congregational mosque, which was being restored by the Aga Khan Foundation. This picture comes from the Aga Khan Foundation before Mali fell apart about 13 or 14 years ago. And here's some of the value that Timbuktu subsequently achieved in terms of the shock of the destruction of some of the cultural heritage. And it also became a story that is, shall we say, somewhat embellished of badass librarians and people rescuing cultural heritage from the threat of jihadist terrorists. Anyway, happy to talk about any of that if you would like. But for now, let's turn back to this chronicle and the author of it, Muhammad Mahmud Wuld Sheikh. So he tells us that he was born in 1910 and that he's from the Saharan town of Errawan, which you can see here. It's about 250 kilometers north of Timbuktu in what is really the full-blown southern Sahara. I mean, it's the full desert. Timbuktu is on the edge of the desert, and it's a city that's surrounded by giant sand dunes. Its streets are made out of sand. It's also pretty much the desert, but Errawan is the real thing. He was born into a group of people who claimed descent from a 16th century Arab saint or holy man who he didn't found the town of Errawan exactly, but he established a Muslim religious sanctuary there. And his ancestors made claims to this sanctuary and to their role in bringing a kind of correct Islamic practice, or trying to bring a kind of correct Islamic practice, to an area that was otherwise peopled by Berber-speaking Tuaregs and different African groups that are called blacks in this chronicle. The founding saint's name was Ahmed Ag Ada, and according to Muhammad Mahmud's chronicle, he was such a powerful person. He was, as I said, he was a sort of holy man. He had religious authority, right? He had religious power. He had command over the unseen. And when we saw earlier this morning, when Mauro and Said's discussion about this letter written in Morocco for an invasion of the Songhai Empire, well, in this chronicle, the ruler of Morocco is not writing letters to the ulama. He's instead writing a note to this guy, Ahmed Ag Ada, who lives in Errawan. And apparently he has found that this is the most powerful, the most authentic Muslim saint in the entire region. And so he says to the leader of the troops that are crossing the Sahara that he must get his permission in order to proceed with his invasion of Songhai. And that permission is granted. Here's a passage from this chronicle which tells this story. It says that the Sultan, if you look at the second half of this, when he intended to invade the land of Songhai, where Ahmed bin Ada lived, he took pieces of raw meat and wrote the names of the famous saints of the Sudan, including Sheikh Ahmed bin Ada, and he threw the pieces into the fire. And the fire consumed all the pieces except the piece with the name of Ahmed bin Ada on it. And the fire did not consume it, and it remained in the fire in its original form. So the Sultan said, "Indeed, this sheikh is the greatest saint in the Sudan." And he instructed Jaudar, who's the leader of this military expedition, not to enter Songhai except with his permission. And this permission was granted. So Errawan and the people that Muhammad Mahmud claims to be descended from are asserting a kind of historical claim over the conquest of the Songhai Empire itself. But most importantly, it's a claim to a kind of religious authority in this wider region, which Muhammad Mahmud goes to great lengths to show. Muhammad Mahmud ended up living in Timbuktu, where he became part of a larger group of Muslim scholars that we might think of as the ulama of colonial Timbuktu. And as my colleague Shahid Mathi has demonstrated, these ulama were quite a contentious group. They often argued with each other in person and in writing. Muhammad Mahmud seems to have been especially difficult. Colonial officials described him as extremely arrogant and argumentative with other Timbuktu scholars. This view is easily confirmed when reading his writings. Very arrogant. Thinks of himself really as the most able scholar of his day. And also what we know about how he treated his colleagues, which was very badly. He's sometimes referred to in colonial sources as the Qadi, or the judge, the Muslim judge of Timbuktu. But in fact, he was only recognized by colonial officials as the Qadi for the people of his hometown of Erawan, who formed their own community in Timbuktu. So the map that I showed you, or the aerial photographs of Timbuktu, near the Sankore Mosque, we should think of that part of northern end of Timbuktu as an area where a lot of people from Erawan lived. He was appointed by the French to be the Qadi of that smaller group of people. And even then, he fell out with them and was, what do you say when you're he was removed from his office officially at a certain point by the French because there were so many disputes and so many complaints against him. His disputes with other scholars became quite famous among Timbuktu's literati. He once refused to pray behind another scholar who was called Sheikh Abul Khair, and because of a dispute over a divorce and a marriage. But such was the enmity that he attracted that this incident has taken on a racial gloss of its own, and he is accused of refusing to pray behind Abul Khair because he was black. Abul Khair was understood to be black. The biographical, the most important biographical dictionary of the Timbuktu ulama, something called the Sada al-Abadiyya, composed in the post-colonial period by a colleague of Muhammad Mahmud's named Ahmed Babir, doesn't even include a mention of Muhammad Mahmud. So he's completely left out. This greatest scholar of the 20th century ulama of Timbuktu is not even in the biographical dictionary of the scholars of 20th century Timbuktu. But despite all of this, Muhammad Mahmud was a very sophisticated scholar. His knowledge of traditional Islamic sciences, like jurisprudence, was extensive. But he was also very well read on more secular subjects like history, as is clear in reading his chronicle. And he also taught himself French in the 1930s, and he seems to have read relatively widely for someone in his time and place. So he really was a serious intellectual at the very least. He was quite profoundly pro-French, pro-colonial in his attitudes. And he consistently used the French as a cudgel against everybody else that he disagreed with. And I can give you a couple of examples here. This is something that I found in the not colonial, but in the sort of regional archives in Timbuktu. And it's a poem that was translated into French from an original Arabic by somebody in the colonial office. And I don't have the original Arabic, so I don't know how valid it is, the translation. But I did translate the French, and you get this sort of sense of how, he talks about, here among the French there is a government which performs good deeds publicly and secretly, in justice and in policy, by mercy and kindness, with benevolence and respect. Her compassion and her benevolence have satisfied all Muslims in every country. So he really lays it on thick. And this is a letter sent to the French, so its intended audience is clearly, presumably enjoyed the divine act, which was God bringing the French to this region to get rid of injustice and polygamy. This polygamy thing I'm not so sure about, but I don't have the original, so it's possible he's interested in getting rid of polygamy because the people that he belongs to are not especially people who practice polygamy, but I don't know for sure. Okay, you might say that's a source which is a bit dodgy. It's found in what was originally a colonial archive. But no, the chronicle itself has even more information along the same sorts of lines. This is from the 14th chapter of this chronicle. The chronicle is about a bunch of different things that happened in the early colonial period. But as you can see by this green circle, the last part of the text is titled, on the state of French rule in this country and the demonstration of its great utility and whose rationality is recognized only by the erudite. We need to work maybe on the vernacular English of the translations, but I think that communicates the idea. And so this is what he says in his chronicle. He says, "Know that prior to the entry of the French, this Sudanic country and other lands beside it, such as the Azawad and its surroundings, were engulfed in killings and severe oppression, the plundering of wealth and the spilling of blood, which occurred one after the other, all in violation of God's laws and following the devil in major sins and to sites of iniquity." So it goes on and on and on at length. In summary, the entry of the French into this land and the way they governed was of greatest value and most useful benefit compared to the way the people were before. The ulama know this, but the ignorant deny it. But he also has something else, which is interesting in the context of our discussion in these couple of days. One of the things that Mohammed Mahmoud says the French do is that they put the right people in charge. They put the true scholars in charge of law, and those true scholars are Muslim scholars. And they take power away from those pillagers and bandits and everybody else who aren't necessarily racialized precisely, and try to create a kind of new order which is based on law and fundamentally based on Islamic law. Right? So there's a claim that the French are doing things connected to Islam. They're supporting Islam. So he says, to start with, the French state is comprised of people of justice and reform for all worldly and religious matters. As for justice, it has been observed that they are among the most just of nations in judging between those in disputes, to the extent that they appoint Muslims as judges to rule in disputes between themselves. According to the Sharia, they appoint judges to administer the Sharia between them and all of those who do not have law, among the pagan blacks, who thereby put into practice their policies, correct conduct, and the benefits and value of it, allowing for the reform of their affairs. So we have here a sort of celebration of the way that the French regime privileges a certain group of Africans in this region over others. And I think it's broadly correct that they did indeed privilege the people that he's saying they did here, and that they did, to some extent, put Muslim scholars in positions of authority. They didn't particularly recognize non-Muslims or people that were Muslim but whose authority they thought was somehow dodgy. Okay, that's another topic to go into if anybody's interested. In the 1950s, Mohammed Mahmoud was the leader of a movement that sought the redrawing of the borders of what would become Mali, so that northern Mali would not move to independence with southern Mali. He advocated that northern Mali be joined to a new a colonial Saharan territory which the French would run, which would include much of the Algerian Sahara and places like the Saharan regions of Niger. In this, he was actively supported by elements of the French military who provided him with flights around northern Mali as he sought to convince notables of the wisdom of this project. You can see here what he wrote in a letter to Charles de Gaulle. Are you coming to call me for time? Okay, can I have 2 more minutes? Okay, 3 more minutes? Okay. He said in a letter to Charles de Gaulle that his people didn't want to live in any country with a black majority, right? He said the blacks are an ethnic group whose interests and aspirations are not the same as ours. This didn't end up happening. At independence, Mohammed Mahmoud was imprisoned by the new post-colonial government of Mali, and he was only released when the regime was overthrown in a military coup in 1968. But in the years that he spent in jail, his health was broken, and he died 5 years later in 1973. The reason why he's an interesting figure is because in post-colonial northern Mali, there had been a series of civil wars that had been highly racialized. One of them broke out only 3 years after independence. And so Muhammad Mahmud's thought commands our attention for this reason. In his political career and in his intellectual work, he did much to insist on the racial divide between what is today northern Mali and its partly non-black population of Arabs and Tuaregs, and southern Mali, which he understood to be peopled by the more or less uncivilized blacks. His term, full stop. He was not the only person who thought this way, but he has come to be identified in the popular imagination as both a toady to the French and as an avowed anti-black racist. So during the Civil War in the 1990s, the second one here, an explicitly black African paramilitary militia, maybe we should better understand it as a mob, burned down his house in Timbuktu 30 years after his death. I'm going to stop, but I want to just point you to, this is what this Saharan colonial state would have looked like. I'm going to just point you and gesture to you a few of the ways that this text makes racist arguments to describe the history. It does so by quoting selectively from previous sources in ways that emphasize Arab, especially presence in this region, and either eliminates or denigrates that of Tuaregs and blacks. He has a discussion about the origins of the blacks, which goes all the way back to Yemen and to Noah, the prophet. But the blacks, it turns out, are descended from slaves, and he goes into great detail describing the different slaves and how each of the ethnic groups found in black ethnic groups found in northern Mali, almost all of them, are in fact descended from these slave ancestors. And this continues. So, as a conclusion, if your project is racialized irredentism, right, changing borders, etc., then fixing the presence of some and the absence of others by omission is easily understood. Likewise, the denigration of blacks as people without law or as the descendants of slaves makes an argument that those blacks who live in Timbuktu or the Niger Band region in general, and who did not want to join this new colonial Saharan territory that Muhammad Mahmud was supporting, they don't have standing to decide or speak on these issues because their true nature is that of slaves. That too is easy to understand. I think what's less intuitive perhaps is that the ethnographic imaginary revealed in Muhammad Mahmud's text is highly lineal and genealogical. True racial character may not be visible in people's appearance or their names for themselves, yet in a kind of magical thinking bred deep in the bone and recoverable only by those who know about lineage and genealogy, the true worth and character of everyone can be revealed. So the work of race is, in a sense, the work of understanding this fundamental difference. Muhammad Mahmud was not the lone voice racializing the politics of decolonization in Mali. I'm pretty sure that his chronicle did not receive a very large audience of readers. As far as I know, there's only one extant manuscript copy. The only people who read it were the Timbuktu ulama. A published version only appeared in the 21st century. But even if it was largely unread, it did produce many responses. And I think the dialogic quality of racial argument is important to emphasize, in part because it points to the fact that this is meant to do some kind of work. It's not eternal or natural to this historical context. It is instead actively enacted on purpose. And this implies other choices that we can think of as anti-racial. Perhaps the most direct response came from this guy, another Malian from a different part of the country, black, Yambo Woolagam, published a novel, this is the title of it, in 1971. And it's a picture of pre-colonial violence that's absolutely unrelenting. It's scathing about the role of non-black African elites in subjecting blacks as slaves. It describes slaves as blacks by definition and as the unrelentingly oppressed people by local elites who claim to be non-black. If the colonial state was bad, the true oppressors are, in fact, the local elites. And so this is the last thing I'm going to say. He says, describing this history of how this repression occurred, he said, and thus began in earnest the scramble to exploit the black rabble. The whites, defending colonization as an international right, championed the theory of zones of influence, which legitimated the claims of the first occupants. So this is about the European colonizers. But these first occupants arrived too late, for thanks to the efforts of the notables and the aristocracy, the true colonizer had long ago set up shop in Nakem. This is this fictional country. The safe for whom the European, whatever he may have imagined, was merely the pawn. So again, we have the same idea that knowledge produces a knowledge of the hidden quality of all of these different actors and all of these people is what really reveals the true structure and the true function of these societies. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you very much.